everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for episode 6 of season 3 of Revise and Resubmit. I'm Dr. Kim Bissell, the Southern Progress Endowed Professor in Magazine Journalism and the Associate Dean for Research and the College of Communication and Information Sciences at the University of Alabama.
And I'm Dr. Annalisa Bowen, an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies, also at the University of Alabama. And we both work in the Institute for Communication and Information Research, or the ICIR, at UA. So, Kim, I have to ask you a question to kick off this episode. And that is, have you ever worked in the industry? And I'm putting around the industry. From our previous conversations, and here's a plug, go back and listen to our previous episodes.
Yes.
That you have delivered pizzas in college. By the way, I also learned the other night that Sean Penn's daughter also delivered pizzas in her life.
Validated in that job.
Right. And I know that you have worked as a photographer and a photojournalist, and that would be the industry, right?
Yes, that would be the industry. I also worked in television for a short while as an assistant producer of a public affairs program that literally no one watched. But it was a great experience, and I learned a ton about the way TV news comes together. So I've worked as a photojournalist, and then I worked in TV.
Cool. So, I mean, I have to be honest, I've been a preschool teacher. I've been a tour guide in DC, and I made it in retail for about 3 months once. And both of us have had a side hustle in teaching group exercise class.
Yep.
I wouldn't call that the industry for what I do now. So I guess I've worked in academia for the majority of my work experience. And today's guest, well, she took a different path after earning her PhD.
That's right. Today, we talk with Dr. Amy Rask, the Chief Operating Officer at MediaScience.
Okay, so I'm going to interrupt you for just a moment. A COO. So Amy is the very first COO I've ever spoken to, and I find that very cool.
And Amy is very cool, and this conversation is very cool. But yes, Amy is the COO at MediaScience, and we're going to learn more about her path to MediaScience, what someone working in the industry does. And again, just a tiny spoiler here, she's still doing research, and it's really interesting and meaningful research. We're going to get a chance to learn more about how some of that research comes about and what it looks like in today's conversation.
And one not just a researcher and a COO, but she also raises, manages, and takes care of, I'm not sure the correct word, chicken. And even one of those chickens in today's episode. Amy, welcome to Revise and Resubmit.
Amy, thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
So, Amy, we know that you are not working at a university right now, and we'll get into that. But did I read it right that you were doing research in Australia when your professional career was getting started?
Yes. Yep. So that's actually, I did a postdoctoral fellowship at Murdock University in Perth, Australia, right after I graduated. And that has brought me around to my current position where I'm in Austin, Texas. So I'm no longer in Australia. I'm in the United States, but not in Alabama, unfortunately.
And you got some puppies there?
I do. So one of my fun hobbies is breeding French bulldogs.
Oh.
So I currently have 6 French bulldogs and a Boston Terrier who's the outcast. But yeah, I'm the type of person that I'm never busy enough. So I always look for other things to keep me busy. And that includes animals. So we also have 32 chickens, which is why you might hear a rooster occasionally in the background, because I'm sitting outside. And we live on some acres just north of Austin. So we've got our little farm life that goes nicely hand in hand with my crazy professional life.
Oh, so I'll just tell everyone. So I have a couple little puppies, and when I adopted them, of course, they don't adopt them to you until they're fixed. And I look at them now and I'm like, oh, these puppies, these two little puppies would make the cutest little babies. Maybe I'm glad that that's not possible.
It's a lot of work, but it's fun.
Gosh, so much to talk about just there. But since you are not currently at the University of Alabama, we'd love for you to give us some basic information about who you are and what you do. We call this our rapid fire get to know you part of the podcast.
All right, Amy. So first, where are you from, or where did you grow up?
So I was born in Birmingham, Alabama. I grew up there. I went to the University of Montevallo for undergrad, where I got to play volleyball.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
Very
and
cool.
one of my marketing professors there told me about this amazing 1-year master's degree that you could do at the University of Alabama in advertising and PR. And I said, oh, that sounds like fun, because I have no idea what I want to do when I grow up, and I was graduating from college. And so I looked into it, and it sounded really neat. And I got into it from there, and in that program realized that I had a passion for research, which was really interesting, because it took me, a whole degree plus some to figure out that that was something I was passionate about. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of my background. And currently I'm the chief operating officer at a company called MediaScience that's based in Austin, Texas. We have locations in Austin, Chicago, and New York, and then we also do online research as well. But it's a consumer neuromarketing research firm. And I'm happy to go more into that later if you have questions.
Oh, definitely, we will have many questions about that. So I have to kind of follow up on something that you said just a minute ago when you were thinking about, you didn't know what you wanted to do with your life after getting through undergrad. When the young Amy was thinking about what she wanted to be when she grew up, what did she want to be? Like college?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've always had a love for animals. So there was one small part of me that wanted to do something with animals and go into marine biology or veterinary medicine or something. But I think my parents were always entrepreneurs and were always running small businesses. And I realized the value of, running a business and the value of marketing skills and business management skills. So I decided to go the business route so that I could help, my family with business there. So I ended up choosing a major that was in business management to start. And then, like I said a few minutes ago, I had a marketing professor that was just really, she made marketing fun. And I realized that connected something I was really interested in on like the psychology side, as well as, advertising. And that inspired me to change my major to marketing. And I still, at that point, I still didn't know what I wanted to do. I just knew that those were valuable skills to have. And I knew that would help me be good at something. And then it kind of blossomed from there. I had these moments of inspiration at different points, along that journey that helped direct me to end up where I am today.
But yeah, that's very cool. So, and talk about just a little bit about, you had a passion for research, and I can tell you that those are phrase that I don't hear often. So tell our listeners a little bit about what that passion is and what that kind of how that developed.
Yeah. It probably goes back to my childhood. I remember when I would have nothing to do, we didn't have a million screens back then to keep us busy. I would, play with my toys and everything, but I would go and get cardboard boxes and I would devise these cardboard mazes for a mouse to go through. And it would be complicated. And I would set up these experiments, and I didn't even have a pet mouse. But I could envision what would happen if this mouse was in my maze. And then, like later on in life, I realized he probably could have just climbed over the edge of it and gotten the cheese. But I think like looking back, there were probably signs early on that I would have, that I was going to be a researcher, of some sort. And then, later in school, I always loved science. I loved experiments in science and stuff, but still didn't realize that I had a passion for research going through that. And then, I think probably in grad school when I took a research methods course, that was really it came really naturally to me, and I loved designing experiments. And the idea of controlling for variables and things like that. And I think that's when I started to realize this is really fun, and I want to do something where I can do research and get paid for it. And I think that's really neat. So, um, yeah, I think it started early, but I didn't realize that that's what it was back then.
That's awesome. And I'm going to reiterate that it's not just me that says research is fun, but
Yep, there's a few nerds out there like you.
So you had mentioned earlier that the work that you do for media science is consumer neuromarketing research. Can you break that down for our listeners and just kind of explain what that is and the types of research that go on?
Sure. Yeah, there's there are different ways I explain it depending on who the audience is, but since you guys know about research a little bit, then I can probably be pretty straightforward. We work with major media networks and major media related clients, so it can be anyone from Turner, and they're launching their new HBO Max interface, so we're doing lots of research for HBO Max. It could be we used to do tons of research for Disney and ESPN, looking at sports sponsorship marketing. That's all happening on the television screen. And then, over the years, that's all transformed to testing different types of devices and, how those different advertising messages come through across different platforms and how to maximize those advertising formats, and things like that. But I would say the majority of what we do is around advertising, but sometimes it's about the media platforms themselves or the content. We test a lot of live sports. We do pilot testing for new TV shows. So the topics are amazing, and they really, they're really relevant to your day to day. When you sit down and watch TV, and I see something on TV that was informed by the research we did, it's absolutely amazing, and it makes me so proud of what we do. And then the tools themselves, we have a toolbox where we have a lot of different neuromarketing tools. So we do eye tracking and biometrics and facial coding and EEG. So we have a lot of different tools that we use to measure people's response to this content, at an implicit and explicit level. So we're able to look at things like their very precise visual attention when they're scrolling through a Facebook feed and they see an ad. What did they pay attention to? And then how did they emotionally respond to that once they were exposed? And then later on down that pathway, how does that translate to memory for the advertiser, or purchase intent or attitudes towards that brand? So it's all about that that mediated message that's coming through on some sort of electronic or screen, electronic device or some sort of screen, and how people process that information and how that translates to persuasion.
wow.
Okay, so many follow-up questions. But let me start with something you said that you test live sports.
Mhm.
So can you explain to our listeners a little bit about what that looks like? What are you testing? What are you trying to measure in those sorts of scenarios?
Yeah, so it depends. It depends on who the client is and what the goals are of the research. This past year, we did some research for Fox Sports, and we were looking at the power of live sports. So when it comes to advertising impact, are advertisers better perceived and better remembered if they appear in a live sports broadcast where you're really engaged and you're really excited to watch that game and you're really emotionally invested versus replays of a game or a rerun of that game that you saw later on, or versus the same ads being placed in some sort of primetime content. Um, so a lot of times the questions center around the power of live sports on associated advertisers or embedded sponsorships. And then sometimes we test the games themselves and the broadcasts themselves. So we did a ton of work for NFL over the years looking at the broadcast elements. What are the things that are keeping people tuned in during an NFL game? And at what points are people getting disengaged and tuning away? When are they getting bored and they're tired of watching the game? And how do you maximize the elements within that broadcast to keep people tuned in, basically? Because the tune in is what's important, because that's where their advertising dollars come from. If they don't have an audience, then the advertisers don't buy the space. So the questions vary, but the tools themselves and the way we're answering the questions kind of remain the same. You're just repositioning how you're analyzing that data in order to answer specific questions.
So, talking about all of this research and then things like facial expression and eye sounds like super are people up to electrodes, that sort of thing? Is it scary research?
I mean, I'm sure there are people who are uncomfortable and probably would not participate in the research, but for the most part, it's very non-intrusive and non-invasive. We bring participants into our labs. So we have state-of-the-art research laboratories in the three cities that I mentioned, in Austin, Chicago, and New York. And we basically have viewing stations. We also have simulated living rooms, depending on, what's more appropriate for the question at hand. And then once they sit down, we have remote eye trackers. So it's basically an infrared unit that's underneath the screen that's detecting their pupils and the placement in relation to the screen. So they're not wearing anything on their face. For the facial expression coding, that's also artificial intelligence software that's marking key locations on the face so that it can look at micro expressions and then translate that into emotional response. So that's being done with just a high definition camera that's also, not touching the person. And then for the biometrics, we look at galvanic skin response and heart rate, and those are collected from electrodes or sensors. So we call them sensors for the participants because it's not as scary. But those are placed on the person's non-dominant hand, and then they just keep that hand in a comfortable position while they're. So unless we're doing EEG, that's the only thing that's touching them. So it's very non-invasive, and the person usually forgets that they're being recorded. They do provide consent at the beginning, but you would laugh at the numerous instances of someone doing everyday things while they're being recorded, and it's like they just forget they're being recorded. I mean, they might doze off and fall asleep. They might pick their nose. So yeah, we get good natural reactions even though it's in an artificial environment.
Okay, so again, many follow-up questions, but let me follow up on this idea about participants, because most of our listeners are going to be coming out of an academic world where things like IRB, IRB&B are not our favorite phrases. And certainly when you think about hooking participants up to anything, even if it's not invasive, for us in the academic world, that can be a pretty labor intensive process, getting IRB approval. What is it like in your world?
I think that was one of the most relieving things I realized when going into this area of research, is that we don't have an IRB or an ethics committee that we have to get approval from. As an industry body, we still have basic standards, and we try to hold ourselves to high standards when it comes to getting informed consent, and making sure that participants are safe and that they understand exactly what's happening. There's also legal implications. You need legal consent from them to hook them up to these things, so they can't come back and say that, what we did erased their brain power or something. I mean, there's some crazy things that come up. But that being said, we can turn around the planning and prep for a study in 24 hours or less. If a client calls us and they have an emergency and they're like, hey, this news broadcast just aired, we need to test people's response to it. This was important for our industry. This is important for our company. We need results tomorrow. then we have the ability to design that experiment, recruit the participants, run them in 24 hours, and then spit out the data and the results without having to get approval from anybody. So it's pretty magical that we don't have to work with IRB, even though, the IRB is very valuable. It's looking out for the best interests of participants and making sure, that we're keeping everybody safe. But as long as, we're operating ethically and following similar standards, then we're basically approving the procedures ourselves.
Wow. But the idea of turning a study around and collecting data in 24 hours, that does seem pretty magical.
It is. It's impressive. And I mean, it's no small feat because we have a lot of departments within our team where you've got someone who's in charge of video editing, you've got someone in charge of software programming, someone in charge of recruitment, someone in charge of the data coding, someone in charge of analysis, someone in charge of project management. So you've got all of these moving parts that have to work really beautifully together to pull that off. But it's doable and it's fun. Those are the things that energize me, those types of challenges and figuring that out and making it work and actually pulling it off.
All right. Question. I feel like we always have like this idea that we're going to ask like 45 questions and then but so what I want to know is that you have seen like your research like come to life and seen the outcomes of your research. Can you ever take your research off? Like in work? Are you always thinking like
I'm so sorry that the question part of that broke up. I don't know if it was my Wi-Fi signal. I'm so sorry.
No. I think it was me. So, so what I'm interested in knowing is, can you ever take your research hat off? Like, are you always like, oh, this could be a study, or I wonder what the response to this is, or things like that? Do you ever get to just like enjoy media?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think that's like a twofold question. So I feel like in life, it's important to have balance and be able to take your research hat off and focus your energy on things that are not data. And that's why, for instance, I have 7 dogs and 32 chickens and 2 kids, and we stay busy, so I'm able to separate that part of my brain from these other things that fulfill me, personally. But when it comes to media, when I'm sitting back and relaxing, unfortunately, I have to admit, like, I can sit back and enjoy things, but in the back of my mind, I'm always noticing, like, oh, we should study that. I should reach out to them and let them know that we could answer this question for them. Or like if I see something poorly done, I'm like, oh, we should reach out to that client and let them know that they should improve this. So, but I think that's just ingrained in me after doing this for so long that just comes natural. I'm always looking for some sort of experiment that I could do.
So I want to ask you a question, and you can think about this in terms of the studies that you have been directly involved with in terms of data collection or data analysis, or studies that MediaScience has done kind of across the board. But if you had to come up with a headline for what you consider to be a really interesting finding, what would that headline be?
There are so many interesting headlines that come out of what we do. I think one of the more impactful studies that we did, I remember presenting it at an industry conference one year. It was when the industry, the television industry, was switching from those traditional tube televisions to HD TVs. So everyone used to have these big box-shaped TVs. I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember those.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then everyone switched to these HD flat panel. And at the time, ESPN had to transmit 2 different signals. So they actually had 2 different setups that were costing them millions of dollars a year to transmit both an SD version and an HD version of their content, because they wanted to be able to suit both types of TV customers. And we conducted research to show them that if they only emitted that HD signal and it was received on this traditional television set and part of the picture was cut off, it actually didn't hurt the viewer experience. And we tested across all the different sports genres that were out there. We tested all sorts of advertisements, and across the board, there was no harmful impact of them just changing to this one stream. So by that one research study, they were able to shut off that SD transmission and save the company millions of dollars a year by only transmitting the HD stream. And they actually did follow-up research after the fact to make sure that the results held, and it did. So they had validation after the fact that they made the right decision, and the research we did actually, was correct. So I know that's not a single headline, but it was a huge impact to the industry. And then you saw other networks following their lead and started doing the same thing. So it's a behind the scenes change that not everyone would have actually known that was happening, but it was a huge change to the industry.
I mean, when you think about, again, flipping back to academics like me, where if 3 people have read what I've published, then I'm super jazzed. And you think about what you just said in terms of the difference that it made for ESPN and the millions of dollars that you save them. I mean, it's remarkable. And now I feel like I've got to do something that's a little more meaningful.
No, but that's also one of the amazing things. We were talking about like how you don't have to deal with ethics committees or IRB. You also have the ability to change the world, in a more direct way, without waiting for, 5 people to read your article and then 10 people cite it. And then, over the years, it becomes famous and then you get to write a book chapter about it. Where, some of the stuff we're doing it's changing the way people watch TV on a daily basis. And it's cool.
It is so.
So, Amy, you mentioned that you present research at conferences, at industry conferences, and what I'm curious about is, do those conferences kind of look like a traditional academic conference where you're presenting for 15 minutes, or you have a panel or a poster? And then I'm also curious about what you're actually allowed to present. Do companies that you work with just say, yeah, present all of our findings? Do you own the data? Do the companies own the data? How does that work?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. The conferences themselves are structured very similarly to academic conferences. So you have, different types of sessions that cover different topics. You sometimes have panel discussions about, hot industry topics where you have experts weigh in. We don't typically see posters. I think that's probably one of the things that would be missing, like poster sessions. Mm-hmm. But the presentations themselves are active. Sometimes people do raise their hands and ask questions, but one of the most shocking things I realized when I went to, probably my first and second industry conference is how nice everyone was and how supportive everyone was at these presentations. Because, at academic conferences, it's like there's people in the audience who have to prove that they know more than you,
of course,
about whatever it is you're presenting on, or they need to poke holes in your research, to show you all the flaws, which, there's benefits to some of that discussion, but sometimes it's not done in a nice way. And I remember sitting in one of these industry sessions. It was one of the first ones I had attended, and the research the guy was presenting was terrible. I mean, just it was like his methodology was horrible. He didn't control for things he should have controlled for. And I'm the newbie, kind of young professionals. And I'm looking around the audience and just shock at everybody. And I'm like, is no one going to raise their hand and point this stuff out? And I was, too petrified to say anything because I felt like it wasn't my place because I was new. And I remember going to, my boss, Veron, he's the CEO of our company. And I'm like, Dwayne, you wouldn't believe what happened. This guy presented this stuff and it was horrible and nobody said anything. And he's like, yeah, people are usually pretty supportive at these events. And I was like, what? Why? I don't understand. And, and since then I've done several presentations and it's great. You've got competitors that are there who are competitors to us. With a media client, they may have their competitors there and they're sharing information with each other to help drive the industry forward, which is amazing to me, that they, even though they're competing with each other for success, they're still helping each other succeed in this industry. And that's pretty neat. The collaboration that you see is pretty remarkable. And granted, everybody still keeps their best secrets close to their vest, so they're not going to present everything. Mm-hmm. And if they've got some sort of secret formula figured out, they're sure as heck not going to share that with everyone else. But, once they've utilized some of the research and gotten their benefit out of it, they do share it, with the rest of the industry. And it helps position them as an industry leader as well. So there's benefit that way. But in terms of how we do submit proposals, similar to academic conferences, sometimes they get rejected and sometimes they don't. We usually have better luck if we're presenting alongside one of our clients. So if it is client research and they approve sharing it, which is hard because a lot of it's proprietary research that we do not have permission to share. And I would say the majority of what we do falls in that bucket. But sometimes if it's something that makes them look good and will help them sell more advertising, then it is something they want to share. And those are the things that we typically are, presenting at these industry conferences, or if it's something that's just, helping share general knowledge about some sort of trend that's happening, or something that, that advertisers are interested in and doing. And, those are things that get permission to share.
So I'm going to switch gears just a little bit and ask you this very deep question. Consider your professional career. What are you most proud of?
The impact that we have in the industry in general. So, like I was explaining before, there are studies that we can that our clients take that information and they change the way they're doing something, or they implement something new because we said this works. And then when I turn on the TV and see that, it's amazing. And it's extremely rewarding, to know that our research has impact. And I mean, in one sense, we're not making the world a better place. We're not saving lives or doing anything like that, but media are huge, and that's a huge part of our everyday lives, and everyone is impacted by the different devices that we have. So the fact that we're able to help shape and change the messages that come through that, is pretty remarkable.
That's really remarkable, for sure. My goodness, I feel like I can almost have a therapy session right now with my media use and what it all means and the messaging. But what we're going to do is shift gears on you again. When you were at UA, I know you had an opportunity to overlap with Dr. Jennings Bryant, and I was wondering if you have a great Jennings story that you wanted to share, or if you wanted to talk about a class that you might have taken with him or anything like that.
I probably have lots of things that I could share, but I want to share two things.
Okay.
One, which was one of the most eye-opening conversations I've ever had in a hallway. So I read this article, and at the time I was doing research on video games, and this was during my PhD. I was really interested in media effects, inspired by Dr. Bryant's media effects class, probably. But I read this article where someone had they had monitored EEG, so brain activity, while someone was playing video games. And that was the first time that had ever been published. And I was like, that is cool. I want to do that. I want to learn how to use that equipment, and I want to learn how to do that. So I see Dr. Bryant in the hallway, and I'm like, Dr. Bryant, I read this amazing article. I want to learn more about this. Is there a class I can take? Is there anything that anybody teaches here at University of Alabama on this topic? And he said, no, there's not. And he said, but you don't have to take a class to become an expert in something. You just have to dive into it. And I just stood there in shock. And I was like, oh my God, like my whole life, I've been trained to take classes and things to become expert in them. And that's how you learn, is you take a class, you enroll in a class. And I was like, you're right. Like, all I have to do is just find all the literature I can find and just read it and learn it. And it was so eye-opening, because it made me realize that all of these things that I'm interested in, I don't have to have someone else teach me. I can go learn those things myself just by diving into that area. And I feel like anyone can do that. But so that's my first Jennings story. So that was pretty transformational in terms of just changing my mindset on learning.
Certainly.
And then the second one, so Dr. Bryant was on my dissertation committee along with Dr. Bissell. And so we had a good relationship, and I would go to his office often, to talk and get advice and everything. And he asked me one day if I would be interested in meeting one of his former students who ran a research center at Murdock University in Perth, Australia. And he said, it's the Interactive Television Research Institute. And he runs this research center. It's based in Australia. And he might be coming here to do a guest speaker role. I was like, oh my God, that sounds like a dream job. Like, you're working, only doing research, not having to teach any classes. And he lives in Australia. Like, that sounds amazing. I'm like, yes, I want to meet my favorite person. And little did I know that this was Dr. Dwayne Veron, who is now my boss and the CEO of MediaScience. He was a former student of Dr. Bryant, and he had reached out to him looking for new researchers to join him at the research center there. And Dr. Bryant had recommended me. And and I had no idea that this was like all secretive. So he came and did a presentation, and we went out for coffee after. And Dwayne asked me, he's like, so what are you doing your dissertation work on? I said, oh, probably something with video games. And he said, no. How about you do something that I help you pick the topic? It has to do with advertising, so it's still one of your areas. And I will fund your research, and you can come to Australia to collect the data. And I didn't even hesitate, and I'm like, deal. I will do it. And I didn't. And then I called my husband, and I'm like, we're going to be going to Australia. And he's like, okay. So like, luckily I've got a supportive husband along this whole journey. But, so that was how I ended up doing my dissertation research at Dwayne's Research Center, and this was all doing by Dr. Bryant. He arranged all of this, but I did my dissertation research. Then I was offered the postdoc. And then the opportunity came up for us to start this new company called MediaScience. And that was back in 2008. And Dwayne asked me if I wanted to live in Austin, Texas instead. And I said, sure, that sounds fun too. I like to follow opportunities when they come up. But it's funny because where I am today, so this is 13 years later after our company started, and, even more years since that initial conversation. But where I am today in my career would not have happened had Dr. Bryant not made that connection. If he had not said, you know what, Amy Rask is a good person you should talk to about that researcher role, then I have no idea where I would be. So he was, very important, and very, very important role in where I am.
I think that's definitely the things that we're hearing over the conversations we've had thus far. Like one conversation in the hallway, or just one connection that's been made has really kind of changed people's lives in really big ways. So it's kind of not surprising to hear this from you as well. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So Amy, we're going to wrap it up by asking, post-pandemic, we all look forward to things like conferences. Do you have an industry conference that's a favorite? And where are you looking forward to going next?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the Advertising Research Foundation probably has all of my favorite conferences. I don't think they're going back in person anytime soon. I do know that we are planning on presenting in October at one of their conferences, and I just found out today that that's virtual. So, that being said, I enjoyed the virtual conferences. I do think they're more powerful in person because you get to make those connections and have those conversations in the hallway, that could be pivotal in your life. But at least we have a proxy for that. At least we get to do something virtually, and it actually makes it easier for some people to attend that normally can't travel, or they have other obligations. So I think there's pros and cons of both, but definitely the Advertising Research Foundation events are my favorite.
And I have to ask one other question that is not related to research or at all. Is when you travel, can you leave your 32 chickens?
So luckily I have a very supportive husband and two amazing children that are pretty self-sufficient and they're very good at taking care of our little farm when I'm not here.
Amy, it has been such a pleasure to catch up with you. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I think it's going to be really fun for our listeners because you're our first non-academic industry researcher guest that we've had so far, and this has just been fascinating. So thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much for tuning in today as we caught up with Dr. Amy Tilley Rask. This was such a fun conversation. Love the chickens in the background. But most importantly, it was great to hear about the other paths that PhD grads can have that don't involve staying in academia. Next week, we'll have another great conversation, and I do feel like I'm very repetitive because I say that every week, but I say that every week because it's true. We catch up with Dr. Glenn Cummings, a professor at Texas Tech University, and he tells us about how his own media consumption, the TV that he watched, the way that he watched it, how all of that drove some of the research questions that he asked. Next week is going to be so much fun, so tune in at 11 a.m. on Monday as we drop new episodes. Thanks so much for being a listener of Revise and Resubmit.